So I'm Valerie Kinloch from Ohio State University, and it's my pleasure to be sitting here with Dr. Geneva Gay, who is scholar and professor at the University of Washington at Seattle. And I want to just ask you a few questions, Dr. Gay, about CRT and about multicultural education. And I'll start by asking, so for those folks who are listening or watching us, can you just talk briefly about what culturally responsive teaching is and what it was intended and is intended to do?
I think one way to think about this is that cultural responsive teaching is one of those techniques of trying to move the domain called multicultural education from broad theory-based into practice in the classroom. So you can think about it as it's the methodological arm of multicultural education. And part of that methodology is that in some ways it's the appeal of cultural responsive teaching is to do for students who are marginalized and may not be doing very well in school, especially students of color, in some ways to teach them in ways that are similar to their middle class mainstream counterparts are. And those middle class mainstream counterparts are taught through their own cultural filters, even though they may not be aware that the culture of schooling is based on that particular framework. So if one group of kids or one ethnic group of students get the right to learn through the filters of their own cultural orientation, the argument of cultural responsive teaching is that other kids have the right, the same should have the same privileges. So basically you can think about cultural responsive teaching is the idea of using the cultural heritages, the background experiences, and the orientations of marginalized students in order to teach them much more effectively. And that teach them much more effectively, then you can break that down in what it is that we want them to teach, whether it's academic skills, whether it's personal relationship skills or civic skills or cultural competence. All of those then would be particular areas of learning that should be more accessible to students of color through their own cultural filters.
So then is it the case that CRT is primarily based on the history of marginalization for people of color, for students of color? And I'm asking this question because there are lots of students who I teach, who I work with, who would argue that CRT is focused on a particular population of students at the exclusion of white students. And I wonder, what argument would you give to those critics?
Well, at first look it might seem that way, but you have to keep in mind is that at least middle class white students already have access to learning through their own cultural base. I mean, that's the dominant orientation that's going on in school. So in that sense, all cultural responsive teaching is doing is saying other students who have not had those opportunities that have the right to have those similar kinds of experiences to be taught from their cultural frame of reference. So in some ways, it's not to say we're going to do cultural responsive teaching to the exclusion of white kids. We're saying is that white students, you already got that leverage. Mm-hmm. And other students, if you have that leverage, other students have the right to have a leverage similar to yours. But that leverage can't be just being taught through your cultural frame of reference, but rather because you're learning through your cultural frame of reference, they have the right to learn through their cultural frame of reference. So you can think of it then as cultural responsive teaching is an attempt to complement the traditional or the conventional way that teaching is done. So that's one way. But there are some other dimensions of cultural responsive teaching that people who are reluctant, like you described, to engage with this, and that is that there is a thread of cultural responsive teaching that deals with teaching all students more knowledge about different cultural groups that constitute the United States. But you teach them in different ways because the kids are different and kids from different backgrounds learn in different ways. So for example, cultural responsive teaching would argue is that no students in the United States probably know as much about the various cultural makeups of the United States, of their country's heritage, that they should know. Mm-hmm. So in that case then, white students need to know some aspects of cultural responsive teaching, just as non-white students need to know it, but they need to know it for different reasons. And the focus will be somewhat different. So if the focus in cultural responsive teaching is on developing, let's say, cultural knowledge, well, European Americans know about their own cultural knowledge through schools because that's what's in the textbooks. That's what has been going on historically. But let's say Latino students, while they may not know formally their own culture because it hasn't been a part of the history of U.S. culture. So in that sense then, Latino students need to know more about their own cultural groups because of who they are as Latinos and their heritage. But European American students need to know about Latino culture too because they don't know that. Or they know the things that are not, it's prejudicial or it's inaccurate or it's distortions or whatever. So one of the elements then of cultural responsive teaching is to correct the record, so to speak, the achievement record of the country, the construction record of the country, with the idea that different ethnic groups have contributed to the making up of the country, but not all of their stories, their contributions have been told in school.
And so when you talk about achievement record, can you talk a little more about that in terms of correcting the achievement record of this country, particularly in relation to students of color?
Well, one way to think about that is that, and I've said this before, is the United States has always had diverse groups from the very conception of the country. And those diverse groups have made contributions to the making of the country. We sometimes have argued that the United States is a European American country. The European Americans made the country. That's not really true. European Americans contributed to the making of the country, but they were from the very beginning, from the moment that Europeans arrived, whites arrived in this land that eventually came to the United States. There have been other ethnic groups who were present when they arrived. They were making all kinds of, whether it was agriculture, whether it was art, whether it was government. Even the Constitution of the United States is based on the contributions of some of the Native American groups. So on and on it goes. So one way you can think about this is then to say is that, and I've said it before, there is nothing of significance in the history, life, and culture of the United States where there has not been multiple ethnic group present and contribution to the construction of that. So that's what I mean about the achievement of the country. Whether you're talking about war, you're talking about industry, you're talking about education, even when ethnic groups were not allowed in the dominant schools, they did parallel ethnic institutions. And there's no question, in my mind at least, that those parallel educational institutions then did something because, as an example, with African Americans in HBCUs, historical black colleges and universities, for the longest, those institutions produced the greatest number of black lawyers and doctors. That's the contribution to the country.
But why is that contribution oftentimes diminished or made invisible in the larger structure of this of America?
Well, the best case scenario is because I think that part of it is because people don't know it. The powers that be don't know this. But I think, unfortunately, another part of why it's diminished and all of that is because it may be an overused word, but I still think it's because of racism. Another way where you can think about that is because sometimes ethnic groups of color have made contributions, let's say, for example, inventions, and dominant groups have taken credit for them. Another more contemporary example of that is that a lot of the music that is that's pop culture based, pop culture type music, you can think of that, well, maybe not in high school age students, but let's say in the last 20, 30 years, 40 years, a lot of those African American singers and all of that could not copyright their own music. And then it was basically appropriated, it was stolen. Yes. Somebody else took credit for something that African Americans were doing. African Americans, again, I'm just using that as an example, some of their inventions have been things that make our day-to-day lives easier to manage, like the broom, that you used to sweep your house with before vacuum cleaners came along. The broom, the iron, the traffic light, all of those kinds of things that we take for granted, and they're not big things. But imagine you trying to iron your clothes without an iron. That would be a tad challenge, you know. So those things. But now the question is that who took credit for that? You know, fortunately, in revisionist history, at least the record is being corrected, and sometimes those copyrights are then being reissued to people that belong to that they rightfully belong to.
Well, let's go along with this for a little while longer. This idea of reappropriation of Black cultural ways of knowing, of being, of Black contributions to America, for example. And so I'm sitting here thinking about the relevance of CRT and helping us to not just address, but fundamentally alter how we think about Black people in America and all throughout the world in terms of our contributions to literature, to arts, to music, to everything that we could look around and name as being part of the American landscape. And my grappling is that oftentimes Black people are not seen as the intellects or the creators or the innovators, and in fact they are. I think that invisibility has a negative effect on so many Black and brown students, particularly in urban public schools. And so how do we begin to work with teachers to understand that yes, there's a larger reappropriation of Black cultural ways of knowing and being, and yet if we're going to revise history, we have to teach in more equitable ways?
Yeah. I think we've got to, personally I think that we've got to begin with the notion being of how different groups of people were, if you will, socially constructed in the United States. And then what are the continuing legacy of those historical definitions, if you will. I don't think this country, the United States, have ever come to terms as it must eventually, if we're going to ever get out of this stuff, of this differential and these prejudicial things. But the country hasn't come to terms with the fact is that how people of African ancestry were initially looked at. And the country constructed those people not as full human beings. And I don't think psycho-emotionally, psychologically, we have resolved that. And those historical habits, the residue is still lingering with us. So when you have this long history of a people being perceived as less than full human, what we're seeing here of not seeing Black folks as intellectual, as contributors, as people that can take care of themselves as opposed to being victimized or dependent and somebody else have to take care of them, because that's the way the United States first perceived Black people. And until we break out of that psychological mindset, I would call it a psychological imperialism, until we resolve that, then I think we will still continue to see Black folks as being treated less than what we think is a full functioning, constructive, productive human being is about. Now, most people don't like to think about that. What we're going to say is that, well, you know, slavery was back in the days and all of that. But I think that we have to face and ask the question is, what kind of slavery are we talking about? Because I do think that there are residues of psychological enslavement, if you will.
Yes, yes. And then the internalization of that idea of less than human within Black people.
Yeah.
I mean, that's dangerous, and that's a powerful thing in terms of keeping people in their place, quote unquote. And when we talk about liberation or we talk about resistance in education, if we're not talking about that entire notion of less than human, not being equal, not being as smart as, not being able to perform in these particular ways in relation to our white peers, I mean, that's dangerous when we begin to internalize that ourselves.
Yeah, I think you're right, but I don't think that the internalization of, let's say, self-denigration is as extensive as some people would claim. Because what we don't see is the non-public manifestation of those. So maybe the public image might be, there is, in some ways, struggle and survival might be is that publicly I'll play to your own script, to your script. But we don't really know in any great way privately what Black people are doing. So it might really be as if they're, Black folks are playing the role.
That's right.
You know, if that's what you want, so I'll turn the table and I'll manipulate you as you think you're manipulating me by playing the fool, if you will. But some ways by playing the fool, that's the way that I end up being even manipulating you more than you manipulated me.
Yes.
You know, and I'm not sure even if it's possible or if it should, we try to penetrate that private script, that off-stage kind of performance. When black folks are among themselves and all of that. So, because being able to play these different kinds of images and roles and all of that, that has been part of the legacy of survival and ingenuity and creativity that black folks have had to deal with of generation after generation. And I'm not so sure, or maybe I'm just not willing to yet concede that this generation of black folks are just simply saying self-demeaning. I don't know that it's possible. Just as the psychological imperialism, you just don't get rid of it in 1 or 2 generations.
That's right.
This other way in which black folks survived in this country and in many ways prospered, in spite of the fact of not having baseline resources. I'm not so sure that we can lose all of that in 1 or 2 generations.
I think you're right about that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And we can look around the world right now and we can see black people protesting and marching and organizing and forming grassroots revolutionary movements saying, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's we need better educational resources in our schools. And so that's a great point in terms of it's the idea that we often believe it's internalization of this idea of less than human or not being as smart as someone else, when in fact, oftentimes it is a performance in order to survive.
Sure.
That's okay.
Yeah, and there is, you probably know the work of Margaret Beale Spencer.
Yes.
How she has reinterpreted some of those classic studies about the doll experiment.
Yes.
And without telling her own story in her own research, but the essence of it is that she begs the professional community to rethink the assumption that if little black girls prefer, when given a choice between black dolls and white dolls, they prefer the white dolls, and that automatically means that they have internalized all of this self-denigration. And her argument is that maybe not.
Maybe not.
Maybe they can prefer this because they know what that preference can get you, and simultaneously be proud of themselves without doing that. But they're making almost a political decision.
That's right.
Or maybe an economic decision rather than a psychological kind of a precondition, so to speak.
And oftentimes it's also a decision made in the public view.
Yeah,
and
of
so
course.
The difference between public and private
Of course.
and what one does at home is not necessarily what one has to do in the larger world.
And you never know how much people like this is we know from all of the public kinds of things that have been done in all different kind of ways, we know what you expect us to do. So as a self-protection, I will look like I'm living up to your expectation. So that could then be like a barrier of protecting the psyche.
Yes.
When it looks in effect like it's not protection.
Yes.
I just think that these kind of issues are much more complex than we typically have thought about them. And I would say is that one of the things that cultural responsive teaching want to do is to invite teachers and students to think deeper, to imagine to consider alternative possibilities than the quick explanation and interpretation that we have gravitated toward in the past.
And so speaking of CRT, I don't know if you're one to talk about legacies. For example, your legacy and thinking about what your legacy is in terms of the scholarship, education, curricula. But I want to talk a little more about what I think your legacy might be or already is. But I want to ask the question. So, and thinking about you and your work, you write in one of your publications, and I quote, "Multicultural education, like other kinds of teaching, is a moral enterprise that requires deep personal engagement, commitment, advocacy, and agency from those who participate fully and genuinely in the enterprise. Trying to convey the sense and significance of these dimensions of multicultural preparation and classroom practice to teachers through technical knowledge and objectified analysis is important." And so when I think about what you wrote in reference to multicultural education, and then I think about CRT, I wonder if nothing else, what would you want people to know, to take away, but also to implement in their practice when they think about students of color, Black students in particular?
I would like them to see, to try to see beyond the most obvious. And I think many people will look at the trappings and the life conditions and not be able to penetrate and try to see beyond that and try to look at what might constitute, let's say, the core of the humanity of people. Let me see if I can capture what I'm trying to say. In a few years ago, I was going about my business of life and living, and I happened to pass the marquee of a dry cleaner. And on the marquee was, poverty is not an identity, it's a condition of living. And I would say is that many of the kind of things, whether you want to talk about it as the so-called tangible elements of race and social class and things like that, those are tangible kinds of things. And they may look like they constitute the essence of humanity, but they're not. They're conditions of circumstances of living. Mm-hmm. But what about how people engage with those, and how do they, the resources and the ingenuity that they use to go past those in creating quality of life? So even in the worst of circumstances, I think that there is a level. I think, for example, people have a natural proclivity, human beings have a natural proclivity to find goodness in their circumstances, whatever those circumstances are. That's what I would like for people to try to do. I think that's what cultural responsive, and on a moral level, that's what cultural responsive teaching is about, is to say that there is goodness and there is potential, there is intellect in varying degrees, of course, but human beings don't exist if they're not totally traumatized without some degree of intellect. Yes. Okay? Barring those, and a cultural responsive teaching would say, well, sure, there are going to be some few people that, well, whatever, whether they're accidents of birth or they've been traumatized otherwise, that they are pretty much beyond sort of normal range of functionality. But if we're talking about whatever this thing called normalcy is, human beings, regardless of their circumstances of life, they have inherent dignity. They have a proclivity toward aesthetics and beauty and intellect. And they have desire, and they want to know, and they keep on knowing and doing and all of that. So if you will, as some people are saying, is that they have assets. So cultural responsive teaching is about, it's assets based. It's looking at what people have to do. What are the positive things? It's not just what they don't have.
Yes.
You know, but what it is they do have. And you build toward further, you build capacity based on what people have, not what they don't have. That's not a constructive course of action to talk about cultivating the human potential. You strength is success builds on success. It doesn't build on failure at all.
And yet there are some people who continue to diminish the strengths of so
Sure.
many people who
Sure.
we perceive as not having or lacking, as opposed to understanding what they already have. And I think that's oftentimes a danger, that people who on the surface try to implement CRT or try to be CRT teachers, that's a danger that I think so many people fall into, in terms of, I need to fix you. I need to
Yes.
change you. There's something wrong with you, as opposed to understanding that that already is a deficit perspective that's being enacted and directed toward a group of people who might not see themselves that way.
I think a lot of people don't either understand or appreciate the depth of transformation that has to occur. And it's not so much, the methodological things are indicative of the deeper ideological and philosophical and ethical and moral kinds of things that have to shift. And I think a lot of people are not willing to go there, if you will. They're not really, I'll tinker with these things, but I'm not going to go toe to toe with someone. What I have to say is that at the most basic fundamental level, you are wrong. And I will not tolerate your wrongness. I will not endorse it. I will not advocate it, because that's not the right thing to do from a baseline of human beings deserve human respect.
Yes.
Starting there and then moving forward. I don't think people are willing to do it, because it's not a popular position to take. You're going to have to face off with a lot of prevailing kinds of things. You may not win easily and quickly. And because if you win with one confrontation with that, if you will, a moral-based confrontation, it doesn't mean that solves the problem, and you're not going to have another. And that's just the beginning. You're going to have to keep doing it over and over again. And I think, again, I'm not going to even apologize for going back to it, but I think that, unfortunately, the United States was built on a foundation of this kind of immorality, if you will, from the very beginning. So
Yes.
it permeates. It's in the fabric of our country's being, And to do what ultimately what multicultural education and cultural responsive teaching is about, you have to change the fabric.
So how do we change the
You know,
fabric?
kind of stuff.
Can we change the fabric?
I think we can, but I don't know how to do it. And I know people say change come with one person at a time, but the depth and the magnitude is so great that that's going to
Yes.
take eons to do it. I really think that in sort of a historical kind of a sense, to do what needs to be done, the United States will have to go through serious revolution. And when I say revolution, I don't mean that you bang, bang, shoot them up, killing people. I mean revolution in the way in which, let's say, social historical understanding of revolution. And that's when you change the fundamental core of your belief structure. Can we do that? Are we ready to do it? I don't know. But certainly I know that people of color are not the ones that are going to have to that lead the charge on that.
That's what I was going to ask you.
You know, no. I mean, you cannot, social change is not going to occur, the kind of social change we're talking about, is not going to occur by the victims trying to eliminate all the victimization. So yeah, the victims need to be present and pushing this, but the victimizer have got to take themselves to task. And I don't think the United States is willing to do that yet. I think it can be done, but you have to have the will to do it.